Thank you for joining. So I wanted to share my screen here and show you an interesting discussion we had over in the conversation community about messy knowledge spaces. You know, what is happening if you bring humans together into a space and let things happen and emerge out of this space, right? So John Kelden posted an interesting thing here. It's actually on top of his conversation community right now, um, called knowledge safaris. So you're going on a safari with a couple of people, and he termed it. He laid it out in step by step here, calling it a learning journey, right? So let me step you through this because it's very interesting and very much related to what we're doing in a social ledger. So step one here is, use the conversation community as a way station, lounge, point of departure, whatever. So this is the idea of there are already very interesting conversations happening inside, say a space like the conversation community, right? Now, if you take this as a starting point, here people come together, there are 1 billion people on Facebook, and John has, close to 5,000 members in his conversation community. Let's use it as a starting point and then see where we can take this next, right? Go into a deeper conversation discussion of the topics that are happening inside the conversation community, right? And then he raises the notion of, okay, let's open up a knowledge expedition base camp. And as a way, to, the term he's using often now is offboarding. So this is getting people offboarding off the Facebook platform into another space, which could be the Knowledge Expedition base camp. That's, the stuff that I've been talking about in our base camp. Our base camp in the social ledger, meaning sort of the base camp for getting developers onboarded. Right? So offboarding from where they are, onboarding. Yeah.
Is this like getting off the Titanic into the ocean?
Good question, Michael. And it's actually a lot of references to getting rid of the chairs on the deck of the Titanic altogether instead of rearranging them in yet another way.
All chairs, yes. Just to the side, please carry on.
Exactly. So he says, one step is set up base camp, right? And get people into the base camp, get them, started with sufficient knowledge gear, right? Very, very much what I was talking about in getting them ready with some development gear, right? What tools are we using? What's our development process, our environment, and so forth, right? And then he defines a couple of camps already. So Knowledge Expedition Camp 1 is about knowledge decision quality here, right? So by that he means, augmenting our social desire lines and tools, including others, social sense-making, decision-making, meaning-making. So how do we start working together and make decisions together? All of this stuff we've been talking in the past, as one, sort of expedition camp. And then he goes on to another camp here, Camp 2, talking about knowledge development quality. So exploring some different patterns here. In this case, patterns of interaction. And ba is a Japanese word for, a congruent space, where you can play a game inside. And then he talks about climbing back down, so leaving the expedition, and then coming back to where you come from, and then start building some of these structures, processes that you've learned about that seem to work or not, right? And then turning what you've learned, the knowledge you've gathered into assets. So that returning, right, to where you come from. So in that case, the conversation community, and then distributing that kind of knowledge is an interesting feedback loop, right? This is where, cybernetics come into play too. Looking at the system itself and then fostering some change from within is a fascinating aspect. So, but, I don't want to stop here because I responded to John here with a diagram that I want to share with you. Let me see, I have a bigger picture somewhere. Right here. You see this slide here? Okay. All right. So this slide is now taking his story there, right? The 7 points he was laying out there, and putting it into a context of, how can we build this in the social ledger? And the way I'm envisioning this here is, there's a space here in the center, which John calls the Knowledge Expedition Base Camp, very, much what we call it too. And to me, this is sort of the container that creates a situational context or story space, right? So things are happening inside that space. And then there's another notion here that I very much like, which is called a model-free zone. And that comes from Monica Anderson. You see down here, there's a screenshot of one of her talks, where she talks about creating model-free zones in a vat here, sort of in a container, very much like the space we're using over in the social ledger. So inside that vat, you put in some of these signals, cues, posts, whatever goes on outside the vat, right? And try to apply some of these squishy things on top here. These are patterns, right? Where you sort of detect, oh, these are the things that are happening here. And I mapped that here in this diagram with the blue boxes here. So with the empty slots here for patterns that are applied to these things that are coming in from the outside, right? So this is the notion of, and John talks about conversation community as a way station or a lounge or a point of departure, the offboarding piece, leaving that environment here, the Facebook, coming from Facebook, let's say, into a model-free zone here, where, and this is to your point, Michael, right? Three things happen, right? There's understanding that emerges out of this. So understanding comes out of the conversations, out of the interactions, out of the data flows that are going into this zone here. And the second thing is context is exploited. So the richer the context, right, the more ideas would emerge here, the more of the understanding and sense making would happen in this place. And this goes back to, there's a video here at the bottom. I encourage you to watch this. Let me post that link later, where Monica is talking about models versus patterns in her talk there, and she talks about sort of two layers here. There's a fundamental understanding at the bottom of everything that happens around us, and on top of that is a thin layer of reasoning. That's where the logic is happening. But she says, this is a foundational layer. So everything has to go through the understanding first, where you grasp something consciously or unconsciously, and then you build something like a reasoning space on top. And the reasoning space, she frames that as this is where the reductionism is happening. This is where physicists build models of the real world, right? And this is where they apply these models then to the real world examples to confirm that they're really working. And that kind of reductionism and reasoning, she sees that as an additional on top. But she sees there's too much focus on modeling, the world, less focus, a lot less on the critical underlying understanding, the patterns that emerge out of this. And this is what she calls a model-free zone. So she wants to create a zone where you don't apply a model immediately to things, right? So you let things happen and you apply certain ways of your understanding of the situation, right? Create this situational context, right? Create the story in this space. And then you move on. And then you move on to, in her model, is to higher patterns that can be applied on top of the situation that has arisen inside this vat, as she calls it, right? So that's the fascinating aspect to me, and very closely related to what I see happening in the social ledger. So there are, a couple of, if you look at the four borders here of this model here, there's the left side I just mentioned is a conversation community space, but, you can take this into any other types of spaces. This could be not only Facebook, this could be a Twitter space, this could be another chat space, it could be another Discord, Slack, or Mattermost space, right? Where we already have existing conversations happening around certain topics. And we could then have a link there from there into this model-free zone where we provide now additional things. So these additional things are I have that at the bottom here, are data, content, and APIs. So these are additional things we pull in from different API sources, that generate different content, add different content to the conversation, and obviously, new data streams that are coming in to this space just for the purpose of making the context richer, right? To put in additional, things into that space that enriches the conversation. And on the top here, you have the familiar presentation layer, right? So this is the user interface. This is where you have sort of the story controls, where you can sort of jump into the space and say, hey, there's another piece that we should consider now. There's another link I found from an article. There's another, visualization of a way, connecting that, let's say, through a meta map that we want to explore in that space to connect the dots, right? All of these are controls we allow to happen inside the social ledger space, right? And then the other one is sort of the climbing down on the other side is, so what have we learned, right? So what are the sort of cards that came out of this session, the assets that can be now reused in other situations, right? And then reused for onboarding into other spaces, right? The things we've learned, we've extracted out of this can then be shared and reused inside completely different expedition spaces, right? And this is the arrow back now, returning to our hubs and way stations. So the things we've learned feed back into the communities we came from, right? Be that a Facebook community, be that some other community, and enrich that conversation too. So that's the feedback loop that again can circle back into this persistent space, right? So it's still there. It doesn't go away after we established some of the connections and created some of these knowledge assets, but it's still there. So we can return to that space. That's the beauty in for me in this model is you come back, time after time, continue the conversation, you continue building your knowledge and make the connections, continue, changing the controls, adding more story elements to the picture, adding more, data feeds into this, exploring more APIs, and jumping back and forth between, the rich story space that we create here and the conversations that are already happening out there, but sort of the ephemeral conversations, right? Because this stuff will eventually go away, right? Hopefully long term, there will be no more Facebook. But what I'm saying in the short term, there are conversations that are flowing too fast to these channels, right? And they're gone. And you can't track them back. There's just no way to. You can try to search it, but, it's a task that's just not feasible any longer. So they're gone. So this space is, the notion of this space is really to preserve some of these nuggets here that were happening here, and the deeper dive into the connections we build here between people, between objects, between the social objects, and the attractors we have, formulating that into some kind of asset at the other end that people can readily assume, use for their own purpose. That's the idea. There's another guy here who's doing a lot of in this space. Is called Paul Pangaro. He's a cybernetic expert, professor too, and he's written a lot about conversation theory. And one of his models here is, again, very similar to what we're doing here with the social ledger. You can see on the left side, he's talking about external sources coming in. So data feeds, could be conversations happening in other spaces on the information web, he calls it, right? And then some relevance services to pick those that are relevant for our conversation here around what's called a shared white space, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea of a shared white space goes now directly into what we want to do with this story space here, right? So it's not only, don't see it as a simple whiteboard, right? Have people drawing something on a board. This goes way beyond that into a white space where you create all kinds of notions of how do you develop, how do you make sense out of the topic that was raised here, right? That could be using, some presentation tools, some textual and analytical tools, what have you, right?
Can I quickly butt in with a couple of 3 points here?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
First of all, your bottom arrow there, the one from onboarding to offboarding, make it big and fat. Because it's basically, it's not a content arrow. It's not the same as those other arrows. Fatter, man, much fatter. I want about 5 times the font on that. Because it's basically, it's like the big sump where everything collects and reconnects. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Now you see, that says more than the other one. Okay. Second thing, can I drop you back to your previous piece, your conversations?
Oh, sure.
Screen. And at the bottom of the post above, the one that's just off, right, the process, the journey, the infinite game. And before that, wanderer, there is no path.
Right.
Now, this is a book that I came across some time ago.
Shifting Minds, Shifting Sands.
Shifting Sands. It's a motivational trainer guy who is really hot for climb every mountain, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And then he had a realization gradually that not everything is a mountain. A lot of the time you're in the desert and you've just got to keep walking. I think there's a line in there about keeping walking. Provisions, yes, growing legs and going places. There's so many components in this that speak to that this is another model to pay attention to. That often the process of evolution and change is progressive and gradual rather than being, there is our target, let's go. Mm-hmm. And it's there is the target, let's go, that introduces all this sort of reductionism and yeah, I got the answer sort of packages. Okay, jump back again to your last slide with the Pangaro. Great. And now can I grab the screen? Can you drop the screen so that I can get it?
Oh, sure, yeah. Let me stop sharing.
Quickly, I will show you my screens. This one. That's a connective set between Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice and all that sort of thing, right? You know, and it's just connections. A more rich one is shows all the possible connections between a whole bunch of entities. I'll bring that back down a notch. Zoom is a bit funny about this, but there it goes. See, these are just flow patterns, and they're all sortable by filter this out, put that in, you know, let's get rid of all of them, and you can just see the stuff. Stuff is the stuff that's moving. That's from C to E, something moves, something's done. And also when I bring in the currencies on top of it, you can see that there's a currency that reflects the pattern of the event. This brown arrow here is reflecting this stuff arrow there. And everything in the system is just stuff and stuff flowing backwards and forwards. And all driven by, and now I can stop the share and you can go back to your picture, the Pangaro.
Okay, let me switch back. Here you go.
And the Pangaro is showing exactly the same data processes and patterns that I'm talking about, which you've got on the left side too. So I think this is a great roadmap for the social ledger. It's a lovely overview that speaks to exactly what Monica Anderson is saying. See what you got. Don't project it. Don't presume it. Gather the data and see what you got.
Yes.
And that's where I think we're on the cusp of. And this is where I think the conversations between you and John, and I'd rather they were not arguments. I'd rather they were conversations. We're opening to all of these possibilities rather than trying to find the way up the mountain. Because yes, there's a mountain and there's a way up it, up the north face of the Eiger or whatever. There's routes. But sometimes a mountain is actually a desert or a forest or an ocean. And the dynamics are different. Anyway, sorry, that's my intervention. You can edit that one out later if you don't care.
That was great. Thank you so much, Michael. Excellent. If anybody else has something else to add, please do so. Yes, and that's an important aspect to me. So, you know, wandering and exploring is the idea of entering the space where understanding begins to emerge, right? And we add more and more to the context, and find sort of the clues in between those things. And when I say mountain climbing, to me this has a lot to do with going to the next place of understanding, right? So I call it here, there's Expedition Camp 1 and there's Camp 2. So once you sort of set the baseline, get a solid understanding, and bring everybody else on board here, right? Have some presentations, some visuals that explain what is going on, but detect the initial patterns, right, that are happening. I mean, John is particularly good at pattern, matching and creating new patterns. But others need to be in the loop too, and figure out, well, yeah, these are patterns that match to these objects that we're discussing here. But I do see the notion of this is a journey, right? So the journey means there's a next stopping point, right? The next place where we all gather, see what we've learned so far, and then move on from there. And the other thing I wanted to bring into the social ledger is there's sort of John calls it a roped path. So sort of helping others who are now entering this space at a later stage, right, to follow us along, right? Because otherwise they'd be lost. They come in here and say, whoa, what's happening here? But sort of giving them some what's called affordances, right? So typical affordances is, if you picture it as it's a door handle, right? So it's there, you can see it, it's obvious, you can push it down and then you open the door, right, and get to the space behind it. So all of these kinds of affordances, you want to make them available inside this zone, this space here, right? And then help people along who move onto the next stage of the journey, right? Eventually with some kind of an outcome, right? Eventually with something that can be shared to a broader audience, something which then can, start a circulation process of, hey, there are people interested in the kind of outcome. I want to use it for myself, right? And then there's sort of a mini circulation happening to say, hey, let me use that asset in my environment. Let other people know that I find that a useful asset, and to continue working with that, sharing that and spreading that out through other spaces, right? Because remember, this is not only one space here. This is, one base camp. I want to see hundreds of base camps out there and different kinds of spaces, whatever they come up with, what they think is relevant to their own context, create that thing and put it out there. And again, that's very much what Monica is also doing. She's an artificial intelligence researcher too. You should see some of her presentations on general, artificial intelligence. Is fascinating. The point of view she has of that stuff. What's really missing in the bigger picture here, with some of these reductionist approaches where they want to take as much out of the context as possible, right? So they can begin the modeling. That's the typical scientific approach, obviously, right? Don't distract me, I just want to see the ideal world in front of me, right?
The perfect world, yeah.
Yes. But we're not living in that kind of world, and I really very much like what she says.
It's sort of a Tower of Babel situation here. The Tower of Babel was, everybody started thinking we can build the tower to the heavens and so on, and then they found that they were speaking different languages.
Yes.
And we're at that point at the moment that there's so many roads here, so many tools and pieces that the reductionist model will pull us out of the generality and into the particular and stick us straight up a dry channel with no other direction. You got to have the variety.
Yes, that's right.
This thing is filled with its variety.
Right, and the variety, we do this by tapping into all of these other applications and APIs that are out there, the richness of that, bring that into this space, rather than saying, let's reduce it to yet another application, right? Yeah. So we could yet recreate another, like a colony thing, right? One of these many lifeboats that are being created right now, these new platforms that are emerging all around us. It has, then a certain set of rules, a highly structured environment where there is no richness in there, right? That means you go in here through one channel, you discuss one thing, you get approved for something, and then you have, something you can then offer into their internal marketplace. And
it's a mini Titanics. You're going from one Titanic to another Titanic, a little one. So
that's so funny you mentioned that, Michael. I was saying that in a conversation there too. say, hey, it's another lifeboat approach. And there's this don't know if you know Nora Bateson, the daughter of Gregory Bateson. She hates that kind of metaphor. She hates if people use the lifeboat approach, because that's always talking about, well, then some people would survive, others do not. Where do you want to be, right? In that end, right?
Learn to swim in frigid waters. It's much deeper out of you.
Right. So a lot of good thinking happening in this space, and I hope I can convey some of this in this chart here and in the conversations that are happening over in John Calvin's community.
Oh, I think that's a really powerful chart. That one's a keeper.
Great, thanks, guys. Anything else from your end, Jim, Gary? Hope we balanced the conversation today between highly technical, I don't understand a thing, to some generative spaces.
Yeah, I think there's pieces missing in my mind here. I mean, I can see that we're finding order within the chaos. It's I guess it's not entirely clear how all we're organizing it. I mean,
that's chaos for you. That's how it shows up. But I think the other part of that is that every journey begins with the first step. At some point, we've got to get out of base camp, got to get out of theorizing about what's on the edge of the fire circle or the whatever, and we got to move, which means some minimum implementations.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm looking for a hook into, how pattern languages are sort of implemented in terms of the conversation or whatever. Still getting onboarded into this whole notion here.
On board, off board, on board, off board. It's just
one way to bring pattern languages into this area of that lacks the model free zone would be to give those agents in the model free zone access to pattern languages.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, on the one hand, what I'm, hoping to be able to do, with the social ledger, even the social ledger 1, is not so much implement governance, but to reflect what is there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, of that in terms of the same type of thing with these conversations, as to sort of use it to reflect what is there.
Well, this is Arthur Brock's stuff about the current seas. How do you see what is there? It has to be revealed. And revelation is what this is about here.
Right. And pattern languages is a fascinating subject area, and I could even see some kind of a social ledger pattern language emerging at some point. Things I'm already experimenting with. When, say, John takes his post in a conversation community and recently put that into a whole different space, there's another tool called Twist, which is very similar to Mattermost. So a pattern, going from one conversation stream into another conversation stream, and seeing what happens now, right? So are people actually following that? Are people getting into richer conversations here or not, right? And my thinking is, so what kind of sequences, should we sort of propose inside, an onboarding process for the social ledger, right? So once they left this one space, what should be the starting point? What should they do first? It could be as simple as an introductory sequence, right? Who am I? What's my background? Getting to know each other. So these are all patterns that work, in a context like a journey or an expedition, right? And then how do we support that by certain tools, that help bring people together, getting to know each other, right? And then slowly they're moving towards the subject matter area. How do you understand what is actually going on? Do we need to read some articles that are related? Well, okay, that's a pattern. Let's bring that in and collect some of those, right? Do we need to do some analytics, and understand what the subject matter is? Well, okay, let's bring in some of this from this tool over here, right? So putting these pieces together step by step, and that in itself, how do you put the pieces together at what time and what sequence? That to me is a pattern language we could define in the social ledger, and then again, share that as one possible sequence with other spaces that are getting into a similar situation, right? That have a similar situational context. Anyway, so we're top of the hour, gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for listening. We'll be back for more.
Later.
Talk soon.
I'm out.
Bye-bye.